Welcome back, book nerds. This is Library Card, the show for people who want to think deeply about the books they read and get inspired to read more. I'm Megan Gliona. I'm here with Brian Brinkman and RJB, and today is a special day here on Library Card. We started this podcast a little less than a year ago to bring our text conversations about books and stories and movies to life and push ourselves to think about what we think about what we're reading in a more analytic way. And today we are having our first published author on the podcast, and it's our very own RJB. We're going to be talking about your short story, Temple Street, RJ, and I'm really excited. This has got to be kind of weird for you. So how are you feeling today, RJ?
I'm pretty nervous to talk to you guys about it, which is weird because
That
we talk
is
about
weird.
everything all the time. I just appreciate you guys being like interested and willing and, to talk to me about it.
No, we're excited. Brian, how are you feeling? Are you ready to critique RJ's writing, get into everything today?
Yeah, I have a list of each moment in each paragraph that was like the biggest missed opportunity of the
Perfect.
story, where I would have rather the story gone. So whenever you're ready for me to start. No, I loved reading this. I loved reading RJ's literature over the last year. I think that we're going to get into it, but like your ability to craft three-dimensional characters in scenes that feel both really relatable, but also give insight to you as a person, and say a lot about like really, really important transitional moments in people's lives, but then getting into kind of the messiness within that. I love the way your brain works. I love how it appears on page, and I'm excited to talk about it. Even though I've got all these notes,
I need the notes, man. I appreciate it. I'm ready.
Yeah, I think it's so cool to know someone as a friend and then get to experience their art. I think that's a real gift and something that I'm really fortunate that you're sharing with us. And I'm also really interested to talk to you about how you wrote it, which we'll get into after a little summary, because I'm so curious about how much of this felt intuitive or how much was really intentional, particularly like in plot and character development. So I'm excited to get into that. But I'm going to give a brief summary first, and then we'll start. So Temple Street by RJB was published by Empyrean Literary Magazine in their autumn 2025 edition. Temple Street is the story of Ray, who's in Boston for a work conference and finds himself buzzed and walking the streets after his work commitments have ended. Ray used to live in Boston with his wife, and when he discovers he is on his old street, he decides to try and find his old apartment, despite not remembering the exact address. Ray has recently suffered a loss that slowly reveals itself through conversations with different people who live in apartment 2 up and down the block. Temple Street is a meditation on loss and grief and the ways people let go and hold on to those who have left us. So before we get into our themes and discussions and all these questions, RJ, can you share a little bit more about what inspired the story and your writing process?
Sure. Thanks. Let's see. I mean, I think like with anything, it's sort of like with a podcast or with anything we do, like nothing really, or at least for me, maybe for Brian, things are linear, but nothing for me is ever linear. So like, I started thinking about, what it would be like to try and write a story about people who were doing interviews with God in order to be able to like be admitted to heaven. That was where I started with it. and then it kind of morphed into like, I was walking the streets of Boston in March of this year, I think. And because I did used to live there. So I was thinking about like all these people. I mean, it's just sort of like, I always think about that, you're walking down the street in a city and you see all these apartment lights on at night and you're like, I wonder like what's happening with all these people, like what's their story, so I went from this like people being interviewed by God to get into heaven to then thinking about like the 7 stages of grief and how you could like basically be how strangers could be a confessional for someone who was trying to process their own feelings, and that's kind of where it ended up. And each of the kind of scenes is like is supposed to represent a different stage of the grieving process for him, which he doesn't know until he kind of gets into it. And so, yeah, it kind of started from there, but yeah, it's just funny how it like it's never like I'm going to write a story about X and then it ends up being that. It ends up being something totally different.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I totally can see that. The way that I really loved the story was because that plot device of the plot of him looking for his apartment is the surface engine that's driving the story, but then the emotional engine underneath is his vulnerability growing. And it makes sense that it's the stages of grief that he's going through. And I love how the plot structure mirrors his interiority. And I don't think I realized that it was those stages of grief until afterwards when I was taking the notes of this. And I realized kind of when you lay it out in each apartment, what happens, you kind of recognize the structure in a more intentional way. And I thought that was really, really cool. And I think that there's the way that Ray gets more and more vulnerable in each of the apartments and how he
Yeah, I mean,
I mean, this is a short story, but you can see everyone in this story very vividly and very realistically. And I think that your ability to distill a story down to kind of what's necessary is really fascinating, particularly in this story.
yeah,
you.
your ability to limit yourself from going down, like there's a part of me that would every scene I was like, okay, I want to hear more about the conversation. I want to hear more about the apartment. I want to hear more about these people. But I really admire the fact that you limit it to this very these brief interactions where something is revealed and then he moves forward with his life, because it keeps the story moving in a really, like, this is the kind of story that I feel like could be expanded into something of a novel, because there is something within each of those moments where he meets a new person behind door number two. Um, but the fact that it is so quick puts you as the reader in this position of like you're almost tumbling with him into the past. And it kind of mimics that experience where you have had a couple drinks, you're walking through a place that you are familiar with, but is no longer a part of your life. This immediately reminded me of anytime I go back to Missoula, Montana, or an experience I had in 2016 when I went back to Antwerp, Belgium, where I lived in the mid 2000s. Um, and like, you're basically doing these like walks that you used to do into these areas that were so familiar to you and so comforting and so much a part of your life. But you have this experience of realizing how much time has passed and that you don't live here anymore, and that all these people are building lives here, and that this was and could still potentially be your life had all these different things happened or not happened. And that sense can like, it can quicken your brain, and it can make you almost like, it can bring on a lot of emotions. It can bring on like a sense of depression, a sense of almost like panic about the way that time moves. Um, and you really feel that in here. This sense of like, I got to get this answer, but every time I go up to someone news, like a new person's door, like I'm just over committing and like, is this creepy? Is this something I shouldn't be doing? Like, all of that is kind of happening quickly as he's making these really rapid decisions.
Yeah, I think the looping of that reminds me of a lot of like great stories or films where you have a setup where you have a character encountering the same situation, just slightly altered and skewed. And so you see them kind of like adapt to that situation. And I think when you lay it all out, like in the first apartment, he talks to this old lady who talks to someone who is dead, and she feels like the past isn't going anywhere and she's holding on to the past in this way that's comforting to her. And then the second apartment, this man who has this shame of feeling unloved and being a monster and not being appreciated and not knowing where he belongs in the world anymore. And then the next one is the person who doesn't even let him in and they're avoiding the world and shutting everything out. And the next one is the brother and sister, and they're not knowing how to deal with the loss. And then the final one, you use this amazing plot device of the kind of precocious child, and she helps him understand that you have to set memories free to make room for new ones, and that they're not lost. You're just allowing them to open up. And I thought that the way that he moves through those, and because you have him slightly buzzed, you're really good about writing about people who are like a little intoxicated. That's hard to do, I think. I don't know why you're so good at it. I don't know, but just like you're really good at it. And
Just
it's,
yeah.
yeah, and it just happens to give it a slightly surreal feeling in a way that we've all felt. And because every time he kind of tumbles down the stairs after, there's that, it's very cinematic in a way because you're doing kind of this, you're pitching the same set, but slightly altered in a way that I think is super cool.
Thanks. That's really nice. And you guys, and thanks, Brian, for what you said. I mean, I think like the fact that he's been drinking at a bar during the day, especially like at least in my experience, when you like walk out of a bar in the middle of the afternoon after being in a dark bar, you know, and you realize that it's still kind of the afternoon. It just you're kind of like in a surreal headspace, which is what I wanted, especially as you said, Brian. Like, and then you're kind of remembering things that you did in a city where you used to live, but it's totally different, and it's to me it's just like how life it's a good way to reflect on your own life when you've been through when you go back to something, you know, and that's kind of like where I started.
Yeah, I was just reading this poem by Anne Carson, and she was quoting Homer and this idea of like often looking back, and how that is so important to us as humans, and that we're always looking to the past to kind of tell us where to go and also like give meaning. And he's so looking for that meaning because he feels so lost but after his wife's death, and especially after it being so recent and such a tragic incident that he was also implicated in, that felt, you could see him looking back for meaning in a really powerful way.
There's something, and I want to ask you about this, RJ, but there, to my mind, there's something about memory and allowing yourself that kind of altered state that drinking in a bar during the day tends to do. Like everyone can remember that feeling of like, okay, we should probably get out of here, and you leave, and like you said, like people are now leaving work, and you've been putting a few back, having some good laughs with friends, and now you're like, well, what are we gonna do? Do I'm a little bit too pissed to go and do any more work, so like I should probably just walk around like before I go back to my hotel and just like be there slightly intoxicated. And there is a sense of like in that headspace, in a place that's memorable, you almost feel like the past is this more static thing that had you just operated slightly differently, you could have controlled this situation better. And you could have, now that you see where everything ended up, and that you would be okay if you did this or versus if you did this. There's almost a sense of like you want to kind of try to relive that and relitigate that and recorrect it in your own mind. um is that something you think about often? Is that something that like inspired you here? Like what are your thoughts on that connecting to this story?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, I think all the characters, I like wanted them all to kind of feel a different um way of looking at whatever the thing was that they were discussing, you know, like they all of them had a different relationship with the past, you know, even the brother and sister who lived the same experience have totally different views on like where to go next based on what happened before. So I feel like yeah, it's huge. Like it's what kind of informs a lot of our lives, you know? Like it feels like so much of so much of life is so subjective, and we're the only people who really understand it, you know? Like we're the only ones who have our own perspective on it, and everyone's perspective is different. So I think when you think back on like revisiting your past is it's such dangerous territory, I think, for like in life, you know? So I feel like it's like really I don't know, it's scary, you know, in a way, but it also can be like really illuminating. So I felt like trying to trying to toe that line, especially if you're like someone that something bad has happened to, that's like a really hard line to balance.
Yeah, and you see that. I think Ray is surprised by that. I think he starts off the day thinking this trip is going to be, something for him to kind of move forward, and he's out having drinks with friends and coworkers, and then he's like, I'm going to go back to hotel and just relax, and this is going to be my first kind of thing since my wife has passed where it feels normal. And he's pulled into the past, a little bit by happenstance, but also maybe he intentionally walked there. It's a little unclear, but I think that it's really interesting seeing how it seemed to me that Ray's in a better place at the end of this because he has kind of looked to the past and also looked at how other people are thinking about the past. And I love the ending. I think it's really satisfying because it seems like Ray has like benefited from having this kind of like vulnerable moment, this place where he can actually like, he's crying with the daughter and giving her the earring. And I think there's a sense of maybe his first moment of feeling a little bit at peace, or like he is going to be able to move on. And I think that is interesting because it's kind of what you're saying is that it's dangerous to look in the past, but sometimes you have to, you know, to move forward.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of this stuff, at least in my mind of writing it, was like it was kind of happening to him without him really knowing it, but at the same time, like something was driving him. And I was trying to just like balance throughout between giving too much away of, yeah, like, what we've always talked about with writing, like the showing versus telling, right? Like you don't, like what he was experiencing versus what he is acknowledging are different, and I think that's the
Mm,
challenging fun part of it, is like how do you try to balance that so you're not just saying then he felt this way, then he felt that way, but like, as he goes along, you kind of know more how he's feeling than he does in a way, and that was part of what I was trying to get to, which is really hard.
yeah, didn't you have a different version, the first one we read, where you don't find out
Yeah.
the specifics of the accident? I
Yeah.
think the way that it's rolled out here it really works. It's a slow reveal, but it's not one of those frustrating reveals. Like you get the information when you really need it. It's not one of those things where you're like, sometimes it drives me crazy when authors hold back information for too long and you're just sitting there like, okay, you just need to actually tell me what this thing everybody's alluding to actually is. And I think it hits at a perfect spot in here because you get kind of the information you need when you need it, which
Yeah,
I think is hard to do.
it's really hard. Yeah.
Well, and it kind of mimics the experience you would have in this, where in which your head is a bit cluttered. You've had this really traumatic experience happen in your life that you are still trying to figure out a way out of. And you've got this not really bright idea to go and relive your memory and knock on the door of a bunch of strangers. Like you're just like kind of winging it at this point in time. Will this actually work? Will this solve my issues? And so like it's that sense of like a downward slope that I felt when I was reading this, that like it was quickening as I read it, even though you weren't really changing your overall tone, because the more information that he gets, the more information that you then the reader get at that point
Mm,
in time, and like learn kind of about you get a fuller picture of where exactly this character is at right now. But you've already you've bought it, like your descriptions of the way that the street lights look, and like looking down the street, and the fact that like you immediately remember your whole life and kind of like these little patches that when you were on this street. I think we've all felt that. Like there's a building in Missoula, Montana that I look at it and I immediately have like 18 different memories come back into play, and they
yeah.
all feel like immediate in that moment, but they're also scattered, and they're also like a lot of different versions of who I was over an 18-month period in time. You know what I mean? Like there's a lot happening when you're experiencing that. And so then to like learn the specifics of his backstory, I think you unveiled it in a really interesting way. Can I bring in a question from the chat? We have
Yeah.
a listener
Yes.
question here.
Please do.
Fantastic listener out there, Justin Bruce, amazing weatherman as well. Friend of the pod, friend of the pods, podcaster in his own right. If you are a literary nerd and an Eggy fan, please go and check out the Vice or Virtue podcast on the Osiris Media podcast empire. As a writer, did you plan on the emotional gut punch of the last scene while writing, or did it just happen that way?
So I've been writing fiction for about a year, and I guess because I've worked in communications for a long time and done a lot of like storytelling stuff, like the one thing that I always have is a beginning and end. Like so far, I've written probably like 10 short stories and one draft book. And I think like I always go into it with an idea of where it ends. And I don't know, like when the people who are like probably just much better and more experienced at it are like, I don't know where this is going to go. I'm like, I can't imagine
That is
like
wild.
right, like Stephen King writes like that, and he's Stephen King, so like, but he talks about it in his book. It's like I don't know where this is going to go. I gotta just like follow it, and you're like, I mean, I think that happens in smaller chunks, but like I always knew exactly how this was going to end when I started. So I don't know if that's good or bad. I think it's just like how it is, but I'm sure that there are like structural limitations once you know where it's going to end, right? Like you're within a
Yeah.
framework.
I mean, I don't write fiction, but when I write poetry, I don't know where it's going. But as I study more and more craft, I understand that if I did have a more complete idea of the moment that I'm trying to capture or the feeling, then it becomes easier to do it effectively. And so I think that when you're trying to tell a story that you want to get something across at, it makes sense that you would know where it begins and ends because you're encapsulating the story, right? And then you're going to fill it in and figure out how he gets to that moment. Were there
Yeah.
parts that were easier to write? Did each of these kind of apartments just come quickly to you, or were there sections that came faster?
They all kind of came quickly. The last one was the one that I reworked the most. Like the mom wasn't in the first version. Um, there was like some
Okay.
stuff that I like added, and then I think like in each the dialogue in each apartment changed a lot because that's when I was trying to balance the like reveal of information versus just like him talking and processing his own thoughts. So like that was I would say that all evolved, but for me, like I guess for me, setting is like comes naturally. I think the like,
Yes.
but the rest of the stuff is really hard. And also, like, I wish that this was like writing was like magical, like we imagine it being, but it's really just like work. Like it's like you
Yeah.
like all the sayings about like writing is revising. But like you really like I knew I wanted to write a 5,000 word short story. I knew where it was going to start and end, and so then you have your framework, and also like under over 10 drafts, you like go through in certain paragraphs, like as a reader, you're just like, okay, this like isn't doing it. So like, what do I need to do to
Mm,
this sentence to make it
Hmm.
better? Like we need a metaphor, or we need more detail, or we need, it's just like, it's just the being meticulous about every sentence,
Yeah, absolutely.
like in my mind, like writers are just like, struck with, ideas, and they just like go off on this path, and but really it's just about like revising over and over again until it like
mhm.
till it feels right. I guess that's how probably songwriting is. I'm sure that's how most art is, but it's not really a lot of magic,
despite
right?
despite how it comes out at the end, which is why it's so cool. But yeah, I think I teach third grade, and I'm always telling them like they constantly are coming up to me with a piece of writing. I'm done, and it's like, no, you haven't even started yet because this is a craft that you have to chip away at, and it's been really cool to see your process and be a part of that in some ways because it's humbling to do work like this, and it's also cool to see where the inspiration piece of it comes in. And I just did want to comment on something that I think is a strength, and that is you talked about how it's easy to write about settings, and I think that is really true. Brian mentioned this. Some of your descriptions of the settings in everything I've read of yours are really strong. I lived in Boston on Commonwealth Ave, and I walked that route that Ray is walking, and so I can picture it very clearly. And you have some descriptions. At one point, you say, a minute later, he's at the top of Temple Street, gazing down the block, looking at a geometric painting. Shadows at a 45-degree angle, cutting across and casting perfect half darkness on all of the buildings. It's pretty epic. And then this one I really liked too. He stands in front of the building, looking down the block, seeing the street lamps, standing still, protective, like angels guarding the gates. And I know you don't write poetry, but you've got some poetic stuff going on here. This line too, and then I will stop quoting. But he lived in Boston a lifetime ago, but his life here feels theoretical, fragments of something, not a material truth. Pieces of it tug at him, but he shrugs them off as he walks. And the way that you're staccatoing your prepositional phrases there with commas is it gives the writing a rhythm that's very poetic and also condenses time down in a way that I think really helps describe a setting that doesn't make it boring. I think that's the easiest way to say it, but it's not. A lot of times when people describe setting, Ocean Vuong does this like amazing. The way he describes setting is he puts you in there so immediately that it doesn't feel like you're painting these broad strokes, but like you're delivering things really concretely. And I think you do that really well here as well in the setting descriptions.
Thank you. That's really nice. I mean, I think like just some of it is like what Brian was saying about describing about walking through places you've been, and you can kind of like see that he's trying to evade stuff, you know? So it's like what can
Mm.
you say that would help paint the picture of him really trying to like avoid things while still like maybe unknowingly walking into something that's gonna end up, you know, making him confront things, but also kind of like I don't know, walking is like that to me a lot of times. I'm like trying to walk away from stuff, but
Yeah.
but it never works, right? Like you always
Mhm.
it always catches up with you, right? So
Yeah. So
like
that's why you've got the shadows, is that this kind of like idea of like hiding
yeah,
things and it being exposed
exactly. And
and
things like
hidden.
tugging at him and him trying to get away from them. I think he's like trying to get away from it without realizing that he's walking directly into it until maybe he knows subconsciously that he's tried a lot and nothing has worked for him to like understand what's happened to him. But I view this as like kind of like what you were describing earlier. He's kind of like foggy about the whole thing, you know, and I don't think he's figured out at all how to like process any of it. So it's sort of like, is it a last ditch effort for him to try to understand like what he's going through, or is it just kind of a coincidence that he finds himself like wandering the streets trying to find his old apartment? I don't know, you know?
I think it works really nicely. It's kind of like a plot device from like a 40s or 50s movie where there is a bit of you have to accept that perfect strangers are going to be willing to allow you into the house.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and like accept that like that is um in this universe this guy's in, which is very much ours. You know, it feels very real, but also like slightly different time and place where people are more open and accepting that you are just knocking on the door in the evening with slight slur to your voice and probably a little bit of alcohol in the breath. And there's like this guy means well. He needs something right now. Um, but like allowing that to be just like a quick hurdle, you then give yourself this. And I think again, this sort of stuff happens when you're in kind of the headspace that Ray is in. You're suddenly thrown into a conversation that has context you don't really have the context for. And you have to pick up the pieces and you have to take in this apartment and take in these people and take in their stories and what's meaningful for them that's as meaningful for them as it is for you. And it reading this, like you get this sense that he's almost realizing what he's gone through. It's kind of just life, and it's kind of just like what you're going to go through in your life. It's hard. It's tragic at times, but it's kind of just what you're going to have to experience to have anyone that you care about in your life. Um, because the stories he's hearing from so many people and the things he's learning from them, you know, the kid who is convinced that his parents hate him more than anyone has ever hated anyone, which leads Ray to be like, I'm pretty sure my parents thought I was an asshole. And it, you know, as a reader, you have this like moment of realization of like yourself as a kid. And also, you know, if you are a parent, like at what point are your kids going to start to have that sort of sentiment? And so like where this guy who's just living in this apartment, I forget, he was working on like a craft. What was
Is
he doing?
drawing.
He was
Yeah.
drawing. He was, yeah, he's a
Mhm.
great artist. Like he's he's got this like thing to give to the world, but he's been kind of like cast aside. And this is something like Ray is experiencing as well. And but at the same time, he's just going to move on from this guy. I don't know. There's so much to the pace of this that I think complements the revelations and complements the fact that at the end, I don't necessarily think your point is that he is completely solved and ready to go on with his life, but this is like one small piece and he's ready to move on and not necessarily look back.
Are there any other themes that we haven't touched on that we want to touch on? The themes that I pulled out that we've, I think, talked about are grief and loss, connection and intimacy. And I really like how both of you have mentioned kind of the intimacy of strangers and the suspension of disbelief that people would be open to that. And also the fact that that does happen at times and can be really rewarding and special. And also how places hold memories and feelings. I think in that way, it reminded me of one of our favorite books, Northwoods, and how the apartment walls, like there's definitely a different feeling when Ray walks into the apartment where he knows it's his old apartment. And there is something about the places that we spend our time and how they hold memories for us. And I really liked how that was evoked here by having these alternate spaces that are almost like it, but not. It's cool.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think like as a American male, like I have a real hard time seeing people's like aversion to vulnerability because I'm like a very vulnerable person. So like a lot of the writing, a lot of the characters that I write about tend to be people who are trying to figure out why it's like so hard to be vulnerable because I find it like personally easy and I think it's kind of fascinating like that most people aren't, you know? So like that's,
It is fascinating and really
you
sad.
know, really sad and I think it's a little bit of like, you know, a problem as a country, you know, but
Just a little one, just a
just a
tiny
little one.
bit.
But like same thing with the people who are like, yeah, this person seems like he's like looking for something. I'm going to help him out, you know? So it's a little bit of a fantastical scenario in that sense, but it also like gives me some hope that like that could be a world where, you know, people would be open to opening their door to a stranger who seemed like they really were like trying to figure something out.
Yeah, maybe
And maybe
this
there's
story will inspire people to do that.
maybe. I mean, I think there's probably more desperation in him than he realizes too, you know? Like I think the way
Yeah.
that he presents himself to people is like not probably how they see him, which is a whole other, you know, thing. Like just perception and how perception is so different you know, from person to person. So, that's a pretty universal universal thing.
Any other themes, Brian, that you want to touch on before we think about some comps here?
No, I think I just really love this story. I'm so glad that you brought this to us, and I cannot wait for our next RJB read.
Yeah,
Thanks, Brian.
same.
It's really nice.
It's really excellent, and it's been so fun to see it out there, and so glad people are getting to read it. Anyone have a
Thank you.
book or a movie that is a good comp for you? Brian, what about you?
A movie standpoint, I'm gonna just direct towards. This is a big one, but I think it has that same sort of energy. Something like It's a Wonderful Life, where you are
Mhm.
exploring someone who is kind of thinking about their past, thinking about their life, thinking about different paths that their life could have taken. Um, it has that sense of kind of being lost in a familiar space. Um, One of the characters of the stories seems to be Boston and the architecture of Boston and the way that light hits streets in Boston, um, which is a really magical thing. And that movie is like so much about what the town feels like, town of Bedford Falls. Yeah, I mean, I just watched, which like is kind of ever present in my mind. I just watched Licorice Pizza, which is a very different story than this, but I think that the one thing that there is a comp with that story to this is that sense of place. That's kind of Paul Thomas Anderson's love letter to his childhood and to his past, and to kind of almost an imagined past in a way. And I think that this book feels like you looking back on yourself at a previous point in your life and thinking back on, what could have been an alternate path. Obviously, this isn't, as far as I know, based on reality. But like, starting with that point of what does Boston mean to you? What did this, part of the city mean to you? And then exploring from there, like what this means to someone else.
The biggest comp for me is the best book I've ever read about grief, and that is A Year of Magical Thinking by Joan Didion. It's a memoir about the year after her husband died suddenly and her daughter became sick. It's an emotional and truly intellectual journey through bereavement. And I mean, it won the National Book Award. It's called one of the best books of the century. It's an incredible read. And if people haven't read it, definitely it's important to read at some point or another. I also thought this movie I saw recently, which isn't perfect, but it's called His Three Daughters, and it came out in 2023. It's about these three estranged sisters who reunite to watch over their dying father in his final days. And some of the issues I have with the acting and also the plot of the story, but it really gets at the challenges and how we look to others and look internally to grieve and to move through in those moments. And the last one I thought about, which is what I always think about when I think about memories and sadness, is Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, because that movie is just this idea of memories and heartbreak. And if something hurts, is it better to have never felt it than to have felt it and hurt? And this kind of reminded me a little bit of that, and how it that movie has a surreal feeling to it too.
Wow. Thanks, guys. So like,
do you have any comps, RJ?
Well, no, I would say that, like, I think around the time I started this, I had just watched both The Apartment and After Hours, which both are like in different ways movies that kind of like, like the wandering adventure of After Hours and The Apartment as a character in a story that is where like so much is happening behind the closed doors of The Apartment. I think probably inspired me without me knowing. But I just looked at the list. I think I watched both of those like around the same time I was starting this. Megan, you know how much I love the book Hello Beautiful by Anne Napolitano, which is like,
yeah.
To me, like that's one of my favorite books I've read about loss and family and grief and that sort of stuff. And so I think that's probably always on my mind. I don't know why I keep writing like really sad stuff, but
it's
maybe
it's I mean, that's what most people want to read. I mean, what are our favorite books? They're like the sad ones, right? Because tragedy is interesting. It's funny because so many parents come to me of kids that I teach, and they're like, "Oh, my third grader's a really good reader, but I don't want them to read like really dark, stuff." And I say to them, like, third graders are so into tragedy. They're so into drama. Like, they love reading about death, and it's a concept that's so huge. And I think that that's true for everybody. Not just that we want to read about death, but that life is full of big things, and the harder they are, the more we need to think about them.
I'm going to throw one more movie comp out because
Sweet.
As we're talking about grief, it's making me think a lot of Paris, Texas, which is one of my favorite movies I watched all year. One of my favorite movies of all time, which is a great wander movie, is a great grief movie, is a great lost in the big ocean of life movie. Yeah, and I think it fits really nice with what you're saying here.
Yeah, the light in that movie too, since we've been talking a lot about light. God, I love that movie. All right, well, discussing this story has been so special. RJ, thanks for allowing us to bring it to the show and for being open and for being vulnerable.
Yeah,
It's
of course.
awesome.
It's been amazing for me. Are you kidding me? This is ridiculous. You guys are you're too nice and too kind. So go back to normal.
It would have been really hard to do this if it wasn't a good story. So it was easy to do. Next week, though, we're going to be back with an episode of Blockbuster Card, our movie series Inside Library Card, because we have to talk about the Paul Thomas Anderson, what I'm calling a masterpiece, one battle after another. So we'll be back next week with that. And Brian will be leading us through that discussion. And I'm really looking forward to it. RJ, you got to see it, right?
Yeah. I'm going to see it on Thursday. I can't wait. It's going to be awesome.
Okay. It's awesome.
Thank you guys seriously for taking the time and all the thoughtful comments and feedback. It's really awesome. You guys are great.
Thank you for writing.
I'll keep doing it.
Okay, great. Well, we can't wait for the next one. So thanks, everyone. And until then, happy reading.